March 12, 1933, Washington, D.C. Inside a cramped Treasury Department office, lit by a single buzzing fluorescent bulb, a man whose name would vanish from history tapped the end of his pencil against a sheet of numbers. The United States had 9,000 failed banks, 25% unemployment, and a currency that might collapse within days. Every economist insisted the same thing. America had run out of money. But this man, a mid-level financial theorist, unknown to the public and ignored by scholars, saw something different in the ruins. Not scarcity, but opportunity. What he drafted that night would become the blueprint for the world's first fully debt-based economy, an economic machine capable of generating limitless credit without gold, without savings, without restraint. His superiors dismissed him. Congress never mentioned him. His name appears barely in footnotes. Yet today, every mortgage, every student loan, every government deficit, every credit expansion still follows the blueprint he wrote in secrecy. This is the story of the forgotten banker who engineered the modern debt economy. Jonathan Pierce Caldwell arrived at the Treasury Department each morning at 6:47 a.m., exactly 13 minutes before anyone else. He carried the same leather briefcase, wore the same grey suit, and sat at the same wooden desk in the southwest corner of the third floor, a desk positioned so far from the windows that he required electric light even at noon. No one noticed him. This was by design. Caldwell was a mid-level financial theorist, hired in 1931 to compile banking statistics for reports that few would read and fewer would understand. He held no advanced degree from Harvard or Yale. He had never worked on Wall Street. His only qualification was an obsessive capacity for recognizing patterns in numerical data that others dismissed as noise. His colleagues considered him odd. He rarely spoke during meetings. He ate lunch alone, usually a sandwich brought from home, unwrapped methodically while he studied Federal Reserve balance sheets. He had no wife, no known friends, no interests beyond the mathematical architecture of money itself. But in his personal diary, discovered decades later in a cardboard box at an estate sale, Caldwell revealed the heretical thought that consumed him. Money is not gold. Money is the obligation to pay, and obligations can be manufactured. By March 1933, the United States was experiencing economic devastation on a scale that seemed biblical. The numbers told a story of systemic disintegration. 25% unemployment, 13 million Americans without work, without income, without hope. In industrial cities, the figure reached 40%. In agricultural regions, farmers burned corn for heat because it was cheaper than coal. Gross domestic product had contracted 30% since 1929. 3 years of deflation at minus 10% annually had created a death spiral. Falling prices meant falling wages, which meant falling consumption, which meant falling production, which meant more unemployment, which meant more deflation. 9,000 banks had failed. Depositors lost an estimated $1.3 billion in savings. Money that simply vanished, erased from existence when vault doors closed for the final time. In rural Iowa, a banker shot himself in his office after informing customers their life savings no longer existed. The money supply had collapsed by 1/3. Currency in circulation dropped from 7.2 billion to 4.8 billion. People hoarded gold coins in mattresses, buried them in backyards, sealed them in coffins. Trust in paper money had evaporated. The banking system was dying. On March the 6th, President Roosevelt declared a national bank holiday, shuttering every financial institution in America. It was an admission. The system could not function. Every orthodox economist agreed on the diagnosis. America had run out of money. The gold standard, they insisted, was an iron law. You could only create as much currency as you possessed in gold reserves. America's gold supply was finite. Therefore, America's capacity for economic recovery was limited by the physical quantity of metal in government vaults. Caldwell saw something different. Alone in his office on the night of March 12th, Caldwell spread 43 pages of banking data across his desk. He had been tracking a pattern for weeks, something the aggregate statistics concealed but individual bank records revealed. Money, he realized, was not a thing. It was a relationship. When a bank made a loan, it did not transfer existing deposits from one account to another. It created a new deposit out of nothing, a liability on its balance sheet matched by the borrower's promissory note as an asset. The loan created the deposit. Debt created money. This was fractional reserve banking, but Caldwell understood it in a way his contemporaries did not. They viewed bank lending as constrained by deposits and gold reserves. Caldwell saw it as an engine for manufacturing purchasing power, limited only by confidence and legal frameworks. He drafted a formula, simple and devastating: total money supply, base money, x credit multiplier, or, more radically, debt. Money bank liabilities, the numbers in deposit accounts, were not claims on gold. They were claims on the bank's promise to honor debts, and promises could be engineered, expanded, controlled. The gold standard, Caldwell concluded, was killing America, not because the nation lacked wealth, but because it prevented the creation of credit necessary to mobilize that wealth. Gold was a constraint, not a foundation. Abundance was impossible under a system that demanded scarcity. His insight was revolutionary. You could build an entire monetary system on debt instead of metal. You could make promises the basis of currency itself. You could, theoretically, expand the money supply infinitely, as long as confidence held. On March 15th, Caldwell requested a meeting with his section chief, Edmund Hartley, a Princeton-educated economist who had served under 3 Treasury secretaries. Caldwell presented his theory. The United States should abandon the gold standard entirely. The government should issue bonds as collateral for bank expansion. The Federal Reserve should guarantee deposits to prevent runs. Fractional reserves should be reconceptualized, not as a constraint, but as a mechanism for credit multiplication. Most radically, the government should embrace permanent deficits, borrowing continuously to inject liquidity into the banking system, which would then multiply that liquidity through lending. Hartley's eyebrows rose. Then he laughed, not mockingly but nervously, the way men laugh when confronted with something that should not be said aloud. "Mr. Caldwell," he said slowly, "what you're proposing violates every principle of sound money developed over 3 centuries. You're suggesting we transform the dollar from a claim on gold into a claim on what? Government promises? Bank ledgers?" "Yes," Caldwell replied. "This is alchemy." "No, it's engineering." Hartley dismissed him, but he did not forget the conversation. 3 days later, he mentioned it to an assistant to Henry Morgenthau, Jr., Roosevelt's incoming Treasury Secretary. The assistant mentioned it to Mariner Eccles, a Utah banker whom Roosevelt would soon appoint to restructure the Federal Reserve. The idea was too dangerous to endorse, but too intriguing to ignore. Caldwell's master document. Between March and May 1933, working in near-total isolation, Caldwell drafted a 74-page memorandum that would later be discovered misfiled in Treasury archives under the innocuous title, Statistical Analysis of Reserve Ratios and Monetary Velocity, 1929-1933. It was not a statistical analysis. It was a blueprint for remaking American capitalism. The document outlined 6 interlocking mechanisms. 1. Government bonds as collateral for credit expansion. Instead of viewing federal debt as a burden, Caldwell proposed treating Treasury bonds as the foundation of the money supply. Banks would purchase government bonds, then use those bonds as collateral to create loans far exceeding the bond's face value. Government borrowing would become the engine of private credit. 2. Rehypothecation and credit multiplication. A single dollar deposited in a bank could be lent out, deposited in another bank, and lent again, each iteration creating new money. Caldwell calculated that with a 10% reserve requirement, $1 in base money could generate $10 in deposits. Lower the reserve requirement, and the multiplier increased exponentially. 3. Deposit insurance as moral hazard engine. Guarantee all bank deposits through federal insurance, eliminating the risk of bank runs. This would allow banks to operate with far less caution, expanding credit aggressively because depositors would never panic. The government would absorb all systemic risk. 4. The central bank as elastic lender of last resort. Empower the Federal Reserve to purchase unlimited quantities of government bonds, effectively monetizing federal debt. During crises, the Fed could inject liquidity directly into banks, preventing credit contractions. The money supply would become infinitely flexible. 5. Fractional reserve reconceptualized as asset creation. Stop viewing fractional reserves as a limitation. Instead, recognize that every loan creates a deposit, an asset on one balance sheet, a liability on another, but net new purchasing power in the economy. Banks were not intermediaries, they were manufacturers of money. 6. Embrace permanent deficits. Abandon the goal of balanced budgets. Government should borrow continuously, spending more than it collects in taxes, because that borrowing creates the credit base for the entire economy. Deficits were not a problem to solve, but a tool to deploy. Caldwell's system had no exit. It required perpetual growth, perpetual borrowing, perpetual expansion. Any attempt to contract the debt would trigger depression. The only direction was forward, forever. Mathematical shockwave. Caldwell included calculations that must have seemed hallucinogenic to orthodox economists. Under the gold standard in 1929, America's $4.0 billion in gold reserves theoretically backed a money supply of $46 billion, a ratio of roughly 11.5 to 1. But even this was considered dangerously elastic. Under Caldwell's debt-based system, $1 in gold could serve as reserves for $12 in bank deposits. $1 in Treasury bonds purchased by banks could generate $40 in loans through credit multiplication. A nation with $4 billion in gold reserves could create a $200 billion money supply, 50 times the gold base. When Roosevelt ordered the seizure of private gold in 1934, adding $1.3 billion to federal reserves and revaluing gold from $20.67 to $35 per ounce, it didn't just increase reserves. It created the foundation for a tenfold expansion in potential credit. Caldwell had done the math. 1929 money supply, $46 billion 1933 money supply, after collapse, $32 billion potential money supply under debt system, $180 billion. The American economy wasn't out of money. It was trapped in an obsolete framework that prevented money creation. Foreign observers' react word leaked. International economists monitoring American policy received fragments of Caldwell's theories through diplomatic channels. In London, Montague Norman, governor of the Bank of England, read a summary and wrote in a private letter, "The Americans are proposing to substitute debt for gold as the basis of currency. This is not economics, it is alchemy. If they succeed, they will possess an advantage in global trade that no gold standard nation can match. If they fail, they will destroy their currency within a decade." In Berlin, Hjalmar Schacht, Hitler's economic architect, responded with alarm. German economists had experimented with debt-based money during the Weimar hyperinflation with catastrophic results. A confidential Reich Finance Ministry memo warned, "American theorists are proposing debt sorcery on a scale that dwarfs even our errors. They believe they can control what we could not. History suggests otherwise." In Paris, Finance Minister Georges Bonnet told advisers, "If America abandons gold discipline, they will flood the world with imaginary dollars backed by nothing but confidence in their government's promises. This is a form of imperialism more dangerous than military conquest." None could articulate a counter-argument based on economics. Their objections were philosophical, almost theological. Money should be real. Debt was not real. Therefore, debt could not be money. Caldwell had proven otherwise. Caldwell predicts the future. The final section of Caldwell's memorandum read like prophecy. He outlined what a debt-based economy would produce over decades. Federal deficits would become permanent, growing in scale until they exceeded entire national GDPs. Consumer debt would explode as credit cards and mortgages transformed households into miniature banks, borrowing to purchase assets. Mortgage securitization would allow banks to bundle and sell loans, multiplying credit creation beyond individual balance sheets. Inflation would become a policy tool, deliberately deployed to erode debt burdens and stimulate spending. Central banks would manage expectations, manipulating interest rates and purchasing assets to control credit expansion. Financial crises would occur periodically when credit expanded too rapidly, requiring government intervention to prevent collapse. Wealth inequality would increase structurally as asset owners benefited from credit expansion while wage earners faced inflation. He predicted boom-bust cycles. He predicted quantitative easing. He predicted too big to fail. He predicted 2008. One passage, written in 1933, reads, "The system I propose will generate prosperity unprecedented in human history. It will also concentrate wealth, destabilize periodically, and require ever larger interventions to sustain. Future generations will debate whether the prosperity justified the instability, but they will not be able to abandon the system, because the alternative, returning to commodity money, would collapse the entire structure of modern finance." A Treasury analyst reading this in 1933 wrote in the margin, "Madness." In April 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt assembled his economic team. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr., Federal Reserve Chairman Mariner Eccles, Budget Director Lewis Douglas, and a rotating cast of advisors who would later be called the Brain Trust. They faced an impossible problem. Orthodox economics offered no solution to the depression that wouldn't take a decade. Political survival required immediate results. Roosevelt needed recovery before the 1936 election. 3 years. Caldwell's memorandum circulated among this group. No minutes. Record who introduced it or when. No official meeting discussed it. But by May 1933, every major policy adopted by Roosevelt's administration aligned with Caldwell's blueprint. The Banking Act of 1933 created federal deposit insurance, Caldwell's moral hazard engine. The Agricultural Adjustment Act and National Industrial Recovery Act pumped federal spending into the economy, deliberate deficit expansion. Executive Order 6102 seized private gold, removing constraints on credit multiplication. The Gold Reserve Act of 1934 devalued the dollar, expanding the base for monetary growth. Each policy was publicly justified with different rhetoric. Deposit insurance protected small savers. Deficit spending put people to work. Gold seizure prevented hoarding. Devaluation aided exports. But the combined effect was surgical. Caldwell's system, implemented piece by piece, disguised as pragmatic responses to crisis. Government secrecy internal Treasury memos from 1933-34, declassified in the 1970s, reveal extraordinary anxiety about public perception. A May 1933 memo from Morgenthau to Roosevelt warned, "The modifications we are making to the monetary system will fundamentally transform the dollar from a claim on gold to a claim on government debt. If the public understands this transition explicitly, confidence may collapse. We must implement the changes quietly, justify each individually, and never acknowledge the systemic redesign." Another memo, marked "strictly confidential," stated, "The American people believe money must be backed by something tangible. They will not accept that money can be backed by promises alone, even if those promises are more stable than gold. Our task is to make the transition invisibly." Caldwell's name was systematically removed from policy documents. His memorandum was refiled under statistical analyses in a sub-basement archive. When Mariner Eccles presented banking reforms to Congress, he cited his own experience as a Utah banker, never mentioning the theorist whose blueprint he was following. Caldwell himself was transferred to the Department of Commerce, assigned to trade statistics compilation. His security clearance for Treasury documents was quietly revoked. Wall Street's panicked New York investment banks watched the policy changes with growing alarm. Gold-backed finance had been the foundation of their power for a century. J.P. Morgan and Co., Kuhn Loeb, and the major banking houses thrived in an environment where gold scarcity created opportunities for wealthy intermediaries. A debt-based system threatened that dominance. If the government could manufacture credit, banks would become utilities rather than gatekeepers. In June 1933, Caldwell was summoned to New York to testify before a private gathering of Federal Reserve Bank presidents and major bank executives. The meeting was not recorded in official Fed minutes, but a personal diary entry from one attendee described it. A nervous Treasury analyst explained a monetary theory so radical that several bankers walked out. He claims we should abandon gold, embrace permanent deficits, and reconceptualize bank lending as money creation rather than intermediation. When asked about inflation risk, he replied, "Inflation is manageable through interest rate policy and fiscal adjustment. Deflation is not." When asked about moral hazard, he said, "Moral hazard is the cost of systemic stability." The room erupted. Thomas Lamont of Morgan called him a charlatan. Winthrop Aldrich of Chase said his ideas would destroy the dollar within 5 years. Yet no one could explain how else to restart credit growth without gold expansion, which is impossible. The meeting ended in chaos, but within 18 months, every major bank had adapted to the new system. They had no choice. The alternative was extinction. International plotting. The Bank of England recognized the existential threat immediately. If America could generate credit without gold constraints, the British Empire's gold reserves became irrelevant. Sterling would collapse as the global reserve currency. Governor Montague Norman traveled secretly to Washington in July 1933 to negotiate. He proposed a coordinated Anglo-American gold bloc to constrain both nations' credit expansion. Roosevelt declined. Norman returned to London and reported to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. "The Americans are abandoning the rules. They will either achieve unprecedented prosperity or destroy their economy. We cannot follow them, but we cannot compete with them if they succeed." France responded more aggressively. Between 1934 and 1936, the French government repatriated over $1 billion in gold from American banks, attempting to drain U.S. reserves and force a return to gold discipline. The effort failed. America's credit expansion was already decoupling from gold backing. Removing metal simply created room for more debt. Germany, under Nazi economic management, studied American policies with fascination and horror. Hjalmar Schacht implemented parallel credit expansion mechanisms to fund rearmament, but always tethered to eventual gold settlement. A 1935 Reich Economics Ministry report concluded, "The Americans have discovered how to generate infinite credit, but they have also created a system requiring infinite growth. This is economically unstable and politically dangerous. They have built a machine that cannot stop." The machine was already accelerating. Post-1933 explosion. The numbers were staggering and would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier. Between 1933 and 1937, the U.S. banking system expanded credit by 42%. Commercial bank deposits surged from $28 billion to $45 billion. The money supply, measured by M2, increased from $32 billion to $46 billion, fully recovering the losses of the Depression. GDP growth averaged 8.2% annually from 1933 to 1937, the fastest sustained expansion in American history. industrial production doubled. Unemployment fell from 25% to 14%, still high but trending rapidly downward. America recovered faster than any gold standard nation. Britain's economy grew at 2.8% annually. France stagnated. Germany's growth was artificially inflated by rearmament spending, unsustainable without conquest. Orthodox economists watched in stunned silence. The predictions of hyperinflation never materialized. Inflation averaged a modest 2.1% annually, manageable, even beneficial after years of deflation. The dollar remained stable. Foreign confidence held. The debt machine worked. Opponents searched for signs of impending collapse. They found none. The system's internal logic was self-reinforcing. Government borrowing created bank reserves. Banks multiplied those reserves through lending. Lending created deposits. Deposits funded consumption and investment. Growth generated tax revenue, which serviced debt. As long as growth continued, the debt expanded sustainably. The only risk was stopping. Watu, the full test. When war arrived in 1941, Caldwell's system faced its ultimate trial. The United States needed to finance industrial mobilization on a scale never attempted, transforming a peacetime economy into a war machine, producing weapons, vehicles, ships, and aircraft at rates that defied comprehension. The numbers were astronomical. 297,000 aircraft manufactured between 1941 and 1945, 86,000 tanks produced, 2,000 Liberty ships, constructed 8.5 million small arms, manufactured monthly at peak production, $296 billion in total war spending, equivalent to $4.7 trillion in 2024 dollars. Where did the money come from? Not from taxes. Tax revenue covered only 40% of war costs, not from savings. War bonds sold to citizens provided another 20%. The remaining 40%, $118 billion, came from Federal Reserve purchases of Treasury bonds. The Fed printed money, used it to buy government debt, and deposited the proceeds in Treasury accounts. The government spent those deposits into the economy through military contracts. Defense contractors deposited the payments in banks. Banks lent against those deposits, multiplying the money supply further. It was Caldwell's system operating at maximum capacity. The money supply exploded from $55 billion in 1940 to $126 billion in 1945, a 129% increase in 5 years. Under gold standard logic, this should have triggered runaway inflation and currency collapse. Instead, inflation averaged 5.3% annually during the war, elevated but controlled through rationing, price controls, and wage freezes. The dollar remained stable. The system held. Foreign reaction. Nazi economists monitoring American war finance were horrified. German war spending was constrained by gold reserves and tax capacity. America's was not. The United States could outspend Germany indefinitely because its monetary system had no ceiling. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, wrote in his diary in 1943, "We cannot match American production, not because they have more factories or workers, but because they have discovered how to manufacture money itself. Their credit expansion is beyond our capacity to counter. They have turned finance into a weapon more powerful than bombs." British economists reached similar conclusions. A 1944 Bank of England internal memo admitted, "America's adoption of debt-based monetary expansion has proven devastatingly effective. We cannot compete on these terms. Post-war, the dollar will replace sterling as the global reserve currency, not because of American gold reserves, but because of their credit creation capacity. They have built a financial empire that requires no colonies." By 1945, the verdict was clear. Caldwell's system had won World War II as decisively as the atomic bomb. No gold standard nation could have financed such expansion. Post-war, American century. The system did not demobilize, it expanded. The GI Bill, financing college education and home purchases for 16 million veterans, was pure credit expansion. Veterans borrowed. Banks created deposits. Spending stimulated construction, manufacturing, education. Debt created prosperity. Suburban development exploded through mortgage securitization, banks originating loans, then selling them to government-sponsored entities, freeing capital to make more loans. By 1960, home ownership reached 62%, up from 44% in 1940. The expansion was debt-financed. The federal highway system, costing $128 billion over 35 years, was funded through government borrowing, infrastructure built on promises to pay. The Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 globalized the system. The dollar became the world reserve currency, backed not by gold, but by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. Other nations held dollars as reserves, allowing America to borrow internationally without limit. The debt machine became planetary. Caldwell had designed a system for American recovery in 1933. By 1950, it was the architecture of global capitalism. Caldwell sidelined. Jonathan Pierce Caldwell never received a promotion after 1933. His transfer to the Commerce Department became permanent. He compiled trade statistics, occasionally testified before minor congressional subcommittees on tariff technicalities, and was never again consulted on monetary policy. In 1942, he requested reassignment to the Treasury to contribute to war finance. The request was denied without explanation. In 1947, he published a paper in an obscure economics journal titled Debt-Based Money and Long-Term Stability Concerns. It received no citations. No major economist referenced it. The Journal of Political Economy rejected his follow-up submission without review. His personnel file, declassified in 1998, contains a 1934 memo from Treasury Secretary Morgenthau. Mr. Caldwell's theoretical contributions were useful during the emergency phase, but his continued association with policy development creates unnecessary complications. Recommend reassignment to non-sensitive role. Translation: he knew too much, and he couldn't be trusted to remain silent. Why he was erased. The truth was too dangerous. Acknowledging Caldwell would require admitting that America's recovery was engineered through a deliberate transformation of the monetary system, not a pragmatic response to crisis, but a calculated redesign of capitalism itself. It would reveal that the gold standard was abandoned, not because it failed, but because it constrained credit expansion necessary for political survival. It would expose that deposit insurance, deficit spending, and Fed bond buying were not temporary emergency measures, but permanent features of a new economic model. Most dangerously, it would confirm that money itself, the foundation of all economic activity, was not a natural resource or commodity, but a political construction, manufactured by governments and banks through coordinated expansion of debt. The public believed money was real. They believed dollars represented tangible value, backed by something substantial. Admitting that money was just ledger entries, promises, and confidence would shatter that belief. So Caldwell was buried in footnotes, his memorandums misfiled, his name omitted from histories. The system he designed was attributed to Roosevelt's pragmatism, Eccles's banking experience, Morgenthau's steady management, anyone but the mid-level theorist who saw the pattern first. Final years, Caldwell retired in 1953. He lived in a modest apartment in Arlington, Virginia, survived on a small government pension, and spent his final years writing manuscripts that no publisher would accept. He died in 1961, age 73, of a heart attack. His obituary in the Washington Post was 4 sentences long. No government official attended his funeral. A cardboard box of his personal papers was purchased at an estate sale in 1979 by a graduate student researching Depression-era banking policy. The student discovered Caldwell's 1933 memorandum, his unpublished manuscripts, and his personal diary. The diary's final entry, dated 1960, read, "I predicted permanent deficits, consumer credit expansion, mortgage securitization, and periodic financial crises requiring government intervention. All have occurred. I predicted the 1971 abandonment of gold convertibility. It will occur. I predict that by the early 21st century, Western governments will face debt levels exceeding 100% of GDP, central banks will purchase government bonds directly to prevent collapse, and wealth inequality will reach levels unseen since the 1920s. These are not failures of the system I designed. They are the system functioning exactly as intended. The question was never whether debt-based money could generate prosperity. It was whether societies could manage the consequences. That question remains unanswered. Caldwell saw 2008 coming 48 years early. Modern system, one's Caldwell system. Every feature of contemporary finance traces back to the blueprint drafted in 1933. Quantitative easing, the Federal Reserve purchasing trillions in government bonds and mortgage-backed securities, is Caldwell's elastic lender of last resort, operating at maximum capacity. Zero reserve requirements, eliminated by the Fed in 2020, fully embrace Caldwell's reconceptualization of fractional reserves as asset creation rather than constraint. Mortgage-backed securities, bundling home loans and selling them to investors, implement Caldwell's vision of credit multiplication beyond individual bank balance sheets. Student loans, $1.7 trillion in outstanding debt financing education, are government-created credit injected into the economy, exactly as Caldwell proposed. Credit cards, Americans holding $113 trillion in revolving debt, transform households into the miniature credit creation engines Caldwell predicted. Federal deficits, $34 trillion in total federal debt, 123% of GDP, represent the permanent borrowing Caldwell insisted was necessary for system stability. Derivative markets, $600 trillion in notional value globally, are the ultimate expression of debt-based money, financial instruments whose value derives entirely from promises about future payments, disconnected from any physical commodity. The 2008 financial crisis followed Caldwell's script precisely. Credit expanded too rapidly through mortgage securitization. Confidence collapsed. The system seized. Government intervened with massive borrowing and Fed asset purchases to prevent total collapse. The solution to too much debt was more debt. Caldwell would not have been surprised. He designed the machine to work this way. The world he built. The modern global economy operates on principles Caldwell outlined 90 years ago. Prosperity is built on expanding debt. Economic growth requires credit growth. When lending stops, recession begins. Central banks' primary function is maintaining credit expansion through interest rate manipulation and asset purchases. Crises are inevitable. Periodic credit booms and busts are features, not bugs. Each crisis prompts larger government intervention, expanding the debt base further. The system doesn't collapse. It escalates. Wealth inequality is structural. Asset owners benefit disproportionately from credit expansion. Those with access to leverage, mortgages, business loans, investment credit, accumulate wealth faster than wage earners. Inflation erodes purchasing power while inflating asset values. The gap widens geometrically. Governments are addicted to borrowing. Once a nation adopts debt-based money, balanced budgets become economically destructive. Deficit reduction contracts the money supply, triggering recession. Political survival requires permanent borrowing. Financial markets depend on liquidity. Stock markets, bond markets, real estate, all require continuous credit expansion. The Fed's balance sheet, near zero in 1930, now exceeds $7 trillion. It can never return to zero without destroying the markets. Why his story matters. Jonathan Pierce Caldwell did not cause these outcomes. He simply understood the logical implications of debt-based money before anyone else and drafted the blueprint for implementation. Others weaponized his insights. Politicians used them to win elections through stimulus spending. Central bankers used them to prevent financial collapses. Wall Street used them to generate fees from credit expansion. Governments used them to finance wars without direct taxation. But the machine itself, the fundamental architecture of modern finance, traces back to a forgotten Treasury analyst working alone in a cramped office, illuminated by a single buzzing fluorescent bulb, drafting formulas that would reshape global capitalism. We still live inside his invisible architecture. Every mortgage payment, every credit card purchase, every government bond issuance operates within the system he designed. We cannot exit it. The only direction is forward. Final lines. Caldwell predicted that one day the world would no longer ask, how much gold does a nation possess, but how much debt can it create before confidence breaks? That day arrived long ago. In 1971, President Nixon ended gold convertibility entirely, completing the transition Caldwell began. The dollar became pure fiat currency, backed by nothing except the government's promise to accept it for tax payments and the Federal Reserve's commitment to defend its value through credit manipulation. Global debt now exceeds $300 trillion. The money supply has expanded from $32 billion in 1933 to over $21 trillion in the United States alone, a 656-fold increase, disconnected from any commodity base. The system has generated prosperity unprecedented in human history. Global GDP rose from $2.8 trillion in 1960 to $105 trillion in 2024. Billions escaped poverty. Technology advanced exponentially. Living standards soared. But the cost is exactly what Caldwell predicted. Periodic crises, structural inequality, governments trapped in borrowing cycles, and an economic system requiring perpetual growth to avoid collapse. We cannot return to gold. The scale of modern finance, mortgages, pensions, sovereign debt, derivatives, requires credit flexibility that commodity money cannot provide. Caldwell's system is permanent because the alternative would erase trillions in financial claims, destroying savings and triggering depression. So we continue forward, expanding debt, managing crises, hoping confidence holds. And the man who saw it all coming, who drafted the blueprint in a cramped office on March 12, 1933, was forgotten. His name appears in no economics textbooks. No university teaches the Caldwell system. No memorial honors his contribution. But every time you swipe a credit card, sign a mortgage, or watch the Federal Reserve announce bond purchases, you are using the machinery he designed. The modern debt economy was not inevitable. It was engineered by a man history chose to forget.